Hello and welcome to Quilt Addicts Anonymous. I'm Stephanie Soebbing. I have some very exciting news to share. I am in the fall 2018 issue of Quilts and More Magazine. I am so excited. This is the first time I've had a pattern published in a magazine, so I'm super excited about it. The pattern is called Line It Up, and it is a really easy beginner paper piecing pattern. If you've never paper pieced before, this is a really good one to start with because there aren't a ton of pieces to work with and they're all kind of big, so you're not fussing with tiny little seams. I really love paper piecing because you can get some really great angles and joins without a lot of fuss because you don't have to cut everything to the exact size when you're getting started. It's like sewing by number. So I'm going to show you how to do that and to put the pattern together in today's video. You're going to have to purchase a copy of Quilts and More Magazine in order to get all of the instructions on how big to cut your pieces and how much yardage you need, and that is available at shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com. And if you really like the way that I put my original together, we've got a limited supply of kits as well at shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com. So when you're getting started with paper piecing, you need some paper to quilt with, and you could use computer paper, but it's a lot easier if you use paper that's specifically meant for foundation paper piecing. I like to use this Carol Dope foundation paper. It's kind of the consistency of newsprint. We also have that on our website that you can purchase. And when you print it out, you're going to be able to go to the magazine's website to print your template, and you need about 2 packs in order to get enough to print for this quilt. You want to make sure you print it at 100%. So you don't want to choose the fit to page size option on your printer because then your blocks won't turn out the right size when they're done. In order to check to make sure that you have printed at 100%, you want to take that 1-inch square guide that comes on each piece and you want to line up a ruler on top of it. And if it is exactly 1-inch square, then you've done it right. You can go ahead and print the rest. One of the other things I really like to have when I'm paper piecing is my June Taylor cut and press. And that's because we are constantly doing trimming and cutting when we're doing paper piecing. And the cut and press has a pressing surface on one side and a cutting surface on the other. So you don't have to get up and down all the time. You just flip it over depending on what you need. So there's a lot of extra paper here that we do not need. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just trim off the excess. You do not want to trim inside this dotted line. That's the line that we're going to use to cut our piece to the correct size at the end. But I am going to get off some of this extra along the sides. You don't need to, use a ruler for this step. Just make sure that you are a 1/4 inch or so away from that dotted line, so that way you have plenty of room to trim stuff down later. All right, so I'm going to flip this over so that way the wrong side is up. And when you are looking at this at home, you can see through. You can see the lines going through here, so you'll be able to kind of keep an eye on that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my color piece of fabric and I'm going to lay it over. And I want this to be going at least a 1/4 inch past where this line is, which is right here. I can see it, and you'll be able to see it too when you're at home. But I want it to be at least a 1/4 inch or so past. But you also want to make sure that it's covering all the rest of the pieces. So I'm going to put a little pin in here. And that'll hold that in place. Now, since this is the first one, I made sure I pinned parallel to the line that it's going to be. The line is coming right through here. And I'm also a good distance away from that line because I'm going to be sewing with this pin in place. You don't really remove them in this one. It works really well if you can kind of hold your piece up to the light, because then you can see the shadow really easily to make sure that your piece is going beyond the line that we're going to sew on. I've got a nice window over here so I can see that shadow that is being created, and I can tell that my piece is really covering that line very nicely. You can see it from above too. You can see that here's my line, and then you can see the shadow of the fabric extending beyond that. And then I'm also extending beyond all the other lines on the side. So that's important. Make sure that that is happening. Now, the other thing I want to do is I want to take my piece 2 and I'm going to line that up right sides together. Now, the first 2 of these are the trickiest ones because you are sewing right sides together, but you are sewing on the wrong side of your paper. So once you kind of get your brain worked around that, then you're going to be good to go. So one thing you can do is you kind of want, you can like put a little pin in right about where a 1/4 inch is going to be. And then you can fold it over And you want to make sure that if you do that, that we're still going to be covering the line of between lines 2 and 3, which we will be in this case, so we're good. All right, so now that I'm happy with where all this stuff is, I'm just gonna go ahead and put a second pin in here just to hold everything together. That's really kind of unnecessary, but it's helpful for newbies to get these first two like right in line. But the main thing is make sure that you're gonna be covering from end to end. So this is extending beyond where my points are. I can see my points are right here. So we're gonna be good. We can put this together now. If your machine has it, make sure you get out an open toe applique foot. It's great because it has this little U-shaped opening. Usually they're also clear. And that way it makes it really easy to see the line as you are sewing and stay on those points. The other thing I've done is I've reduced my stitch length to about 1.5. You want it to be smaller because we're gonna be tearing this paper out. It makes it easier with that extra perforation, and it keeps the seam more stable when you do tear out the paper later. All right, so this is where it gets a little weird when you are sewing, because we're gonna be sewing on this line as we sew down, but we're not going to actually see the fabric. The fabric is going to be underneath the paper as we're sewing, so that's why it's important to pin that first one to kind of keep everything in line as you're working. But it makes more sense as you do it more often. So let's get started. So I've got my needle in the center position. That way it's easier to kind of stay on that line. And I'm starting with it at the dotted line. That's going to be where the end of our block is. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch using that tiny stitch, and I'm just staying on that line as we go all the way down here. And I'm going to go ahead and stitch beyond that line until I hit that perforated dotted line again. If you have a machine that has an automatic thread cutter, it's a great one to use with a project like this. Otherwise you end up with lots of little tidbits of thread as you're going. All right, so now we can flip this around. And I'm going to pull these pins out. So the first thing I want to check and see is that when I fold this over, that it's going past all the lines it needs to go past. And it is. It's a little tight over here, but it's doing okay. I definitely took a little bit deep of a seam, you can see over here. But when you are doing paper piecing, the fabric pieces are cut larger on purpose to account for things like this, where things can get off with that first one. Usually that first one, especially when you're sewing a small piece to a big piece, they can get off a little bit, so don't get too worried about it as long as you've got a 1/4 inch or so hanging off, because we're going to trim next. So this is an optional tool that you can use. This is called an add a 1/4 ruler. It comes in 2 lengths, and we also have these at shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com. It's really great because it has a little lip on it that will just butt right up next to your seam, so that way you can trim your 1/4 inch seam super easily. So what we're going to do is we've got to create our 1/4 inch seam since we didn't have it to start with. So what I'm going to do is just slide that up against it. This little lip stays in place against that seam line. There's no slippage whatsoever. And then I'm just going to trim that down. And now we've got a 1/4 inch seam and we're able to press it. So this is why I like to have this cut and press, is I can just flip this over like that. And then I can iron immediately. I don't have to move to another surface. So now I'm just going to press that up with the seam underneath the piece that we added second. So now we have to create a 1/4 inch seam to lay the next piece against. So it helps if you have like a postcard or a piece of cardstock that you can use to do this with. What I'm doing is I'm just using one of the little cards that came in with the magazine, and I'm laying that along the line between lines 2 and 3. I'm gonna use that to press and get that fold going. I'm gonna slide it up and do the same thing for the top. Okay, so we've got that. Now we're gonna get the add a 1/4 ruler, slide it up against, and we're good to go. So you can see pretty easily here that I'm a little shy of my 1/4 inch, but that's going to be okay. It's still wide enough to where it's not going to make a mess once it gets quilted and washed, so it's fine. I'm not worried about that. If it were smaller than that, then you may want to consider ripping your block out and trying again. Okay, so now that I have nice things secured in place, you don't really have to pin anymore after this step. You certainly could if you wanted to, but you don't have to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay this right sides together with my piece from below, and I'm just matching up my corners. If you wanted to, you could pin parallel to that seam at the top and at the bottom, just to kind of keep that in place, because it is kind of a long seam to sew with as you're, especially since you can't like hold the pieces together. You're relying on them staying together as you sew underneath that paper. All right, so now we're gonna sew down this line that between pieces 2 and 3, because we're adding piece 3. And that's kind of how it always works. You always are sewing the line between the piece you just sewed and the next one. All right, so for this one, I'm gonna start a little bit beyond where the point of that dotted line is, and I'm just gonna sew straight down the line between 2 and 3. And you really kind of want to slow down as you get to that corner, because the corner is where it really matters. If you get off a little bit on a long straight seam, no one is really going to know. But if you are off on that corner and your stitching line is not where it should be, then it doesn't ever come together right when you're all done. All right, so now it's time for more pressing. So I'm going to go ahead and pull these pins out. Press that over. Now we're gonna flip, create our new 1/4 inch seam, and repeat, this time with the corner triangle. All right, so this seam is pretty tiny, so we just have to line it up against that line, fold that over, grab my add 1/4, and trim. So now we're ready to add piece 4, which is our triangle. And I'm going to center that. And this is another really good reason to make sure that you kind of trim this down a little bit, because I want to make sure you can kind of see where that line is right here. I want to make sure that this point is in line with that, so when it flips over, it's going to be in the right position. Another good way to check that, to make sure that you're in line, is you can put it about where a 1/4 inch seam is, fold it over, and as long as it's covering, you're going to be good to go. I'm going to go ahead and move mine in a little bit so that this triangle will stay in place while I'm sewing. All right, so we're going to flip it over again, and again we're going to sew between lines 3 and 4. Just like the other 2 times, I'm starting beyond that dotted line. And then I usually slow down again as I come to that end, because that really matters, that that's where it should be. And I sewed a little bit beyond the dotted line again. All right, so we've got to press this open, and then it's time to trim down, and our block is done. All right, so at this point, the block looks pretty funny. Obviously, you can't sew this into a quilt like this, so we've got to trim it out first, and then we're ready to go. So what you want to do is you want to line up the 1/4 inch line with your ruler with the solid line on your block. And that will ensure that you have a nice 1/4 inch seam when you are done with this. If you're a scrap saver, there's lots of fun scraps that you can stash away when you do these projects. All right, got that lined up. Now that looks a lot better. All right, so this is a block. It's really simple as far as paper piecing goes, but it allows us to get really cool lines that are going diagonally across your quilt. So I'm gonna make one more block, and then I'm gonna show you guys how to join these so that you get perfect points every time. So the best part about paper piecing is getting really great joins where everything just looks like it was sewn absolutely perfectly. So I'm gonna show you how to do that next. So I've got 2 here together. You can see there's an offset, and that's because they have to join it at a 1/4 inch. And at the 1/4 inch seam, it's gonna be perfect. So when we flip these over, you can see that on each one of these, there is a point where the seam that we sewed intersects the outside line, which is going to be the edge of the finished block, and that's on both sides, and that's at the same level on both of those blocks. So as long as we get those two parts to be together, we're going to be good. I'm going to show you how to do that. So first thing I'm going to do is lay everything right sides together, and then I'm going to pin this side, and I'm just putting a little pin in here so I remember what side it is that I'm supposed to pin together so that I don't do it the wrong way. And then I'm going to turn it so that the side I'm pinning is facing away from me. I find it easier to pin when it's going away from me instead of to the side. All right, so here is my #1 trick for getting perfect triangles. So what I'm doing is I'm putting my pin in right where all of those seams come together, and then I want it to come out the other side where all of those seams are coming together. Sounds simple, right? So here's how you do it. So we've got it in the 1/2. And now at first I'm gonna kind of eyeball where I think that is over here. And then I'm gonna check on the back side and see how close I was. I wasn't very close. So what I'm gonna do is going from this side, just gonna kind of work that needle down or the pin down until it's coming out where everything comes together on the back and on the front. Now, I'm not going to pin with this one because if I were to rock this pin back and forth, it's going to shift the top one forward and the bottom one to the back, and then I won't have a straight seam anymore. It'll be offset a little bit. So I'm pinching this with my thumb and forefinger and keeping this pin going straight up and down. Now with the second pin, I'm going to come in from the side and pin across that seam, and that will help keep everything in line until I'm ready to sew. So now I can go ahead and pull this one out. I haven't shifted anything around, but I know that those seams are going to be really as good as they can get. Now I put my regular presser foot back on the machine and set my machine to sew a 1/4 inch stitch because now we're sewing blocks together, we're not paper piecing anymore. So I'm gonna, just like normal, line up my corners, get it ready to go through here. I still am using a shorter stitch length though, because you want to keep that stitch tiny for when we rip those papers out in a minute. All right, let's remove that pin. Make sure your corners are lined up at the bottom and stitch all the way down. All right, it's a moment of truth time. Let's see how we did. Oh, great join. This is fabulous. It's going straight across here, and then we'll do the same thing when we join the rows together. But that's basically what you do. You gotta line those guys up, and then you'll have a really solid, and this looks like a solid piece going through, but it's not. It's triangle and then a trapezoid there. So that's it. That is how you put together the Line It Up quilt, which is featured in the fall 2018 issue of Quilts and More. We have copies of Quilts and More while they last at shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com. We also have kits for this pattern, so if you like the way it looks in the magazine, you can get it and make it just like that if you like. If you just want the pattern, we can just pick up that pattern. We also have everything else you need. We've got the Carol Doak foundation paper. We have the Add a Quarter ruler. So if you like this, you want to make this and make it easier, definitely check it out. Go to shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com and get everything you need to make this pattern. Thanks so much for following along, and happy quilting. I probably should show you guys one more thing, and that's how to get this paper off. So what you're gonna do is you're just gonna kind of fold it back and pull. And I kind of start at the edges and work my way in, because once you pulled one off, then it's sort of perforated and it's easier to go from there, and it just comes off. Now when you get in these smaller seams, it can be a little bit more tricky because they are tinier and you have seams going through them. If you get a stubborn one, tweezers can be really helpful with that. It is important to get as much of the paper out, really all of it if you can, before you start going, because otherwise it's going to be crinkly when you have your final quilt. You don't want that. But the majority of these pieces, especially on a quilt like this, they're going to come off really easily. You just kind of have to dig your fingernail underneath wherever you ripped off the last one at that seam, and as long as you use that little seam allowance, it's going to come off really easily. I tend to leave my paper on until the entire quilt top is completed, just because these seams are all biased and it helps keep everything from stretching out of place when you are sewing it together. I find I get better results if I do it that way. This is kind of a pain, so turn on your favorite Netflix show, get your husband involved. I've had my husband involved in it many times and we haven't wanted to file for divorce afterwards yet, so it's okay. It takes time. The other tip I would give you is, maybe this is a lot of paper piecing blocks, so maybe just do one colorway at a time, and then that way you can feel accomplished. You finish however many blocks are in each colorway, and then you can move on to the next one the next time you get a chance to sit down and sew. So again, thanks for following along and happy quilting.